Hey Corey, it's good to meet you finally.
Yes, good to meet you.
And thanks for doing this. There's so much I want to talk about, and I definitely want to make sure that my folks are introduced to your background as the ultimate Tolkien guru. But I'm equally fascinated by uh, Signum University and how that evolved and all of that, particularly in the context of skyrocketing higher education costs. And you've talked about that a lot. So I got a lot I want to cover, but why don't you give us a little bit of background before you started the university? You were a college professor with an
Yes,
obsession with Tolkien, doing normal college professor stuff.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. No, I was trained as a medievalist. That was my, I medieval literature was my thing, and I was in a tenure track position when I started the Tolkien stuff. I began teaching some courses on Tolkien, which is a very natural extension for medievalists who are interested in fantasy. In fact, there are a lot of people who become medievalists because they're Tolkien fans as children. He's kind of a gateway drug to the Middle Ages in a lot of ways. So yeah, that was all very normal. The start of everything was my podcast, really, my Tolkien Professor podcast, which I began. And I first began that primarily because naturally, I was a junior professor, so I was being pushed to publish. And I was increasingly frustrated with academic publishing because I was like, okay, so I'm going to do all this work and I'm going to publish things which like only 50 people are ever going to be able to read because it's locked away and, nobody else can access it. So I wanted to put stuff out there. I'm like, I want to publish on Tolkien. There are like thousands of people out there who would be interested to talk about this. So I started a podcast instead, basically. And that was kind of where things sort of got started.
And that was what, 2009? That was pretty early on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
2009. Yeah, it was pretty early on.
And
Yeah.
it
So, and
turned
that,
out there were more than thousands.
there were more than thousands. I rather underestimated the number of people, and so yeah, there were, in the end, more than 100,000 folks who ended up following me, and it was a very enthusiastic conversation, especially back then, as you say, it was pretty early on in the days of podcasting, so there weren't so many options for folks to be able to kind of get this kind of academic content. Somebody who was really taking the work that they loved as a fan seriously academically in the way that I was, and so it was something that was really fresh for a lot of people and was very exciting. And it was them initially kind of pushing back, not pushing back, but pushing forward, really, and wanting more and more, and wanting to be able to take courses. And hey, we should, I would love to be able to take courses in this. That led me to start experimenting in the context of my podcast with online delivery and thinking about doing interactive courses. I experimented with my first ever online interactive course, because again, that was also early days of online education. Go back to 2010, which is when I was starting to experiment with this. The online education world was basically just Phoenix and a few other, very early adopters, and people, especially in the education world, were extremely distrustful of online education. It was online education was a synonym back in those days for this sort of shyster product trying to pass itself off as education, but really just being some kind of online diploma mill was what everybody assumed about online education back in 2010. So the thing that was exciting to me was seeing how you could actually do, like through my experiments, I found you can really do live interactive teaching, which is every bit as good as classroom teaching, brick and mortar classroom teaching. And yet, of course, the accessibility of that, I could immediately see the possibilities for what you could do if you really focused on that. And I began to sort of think, gosh, if we actually created an institution which focused on this kind of thing, really, intensely focusing on teaching so that we're having really great connections between teachers and students, but without the physical campus, that's a game changer. That's a complete game changer. And the tuition thing is always something that was a real burden to me as a professor. I'd gotten tenure by then, but still, it was it felt a moral burden. I mean, I'm I am from very modest financial background myself, and sitting there in my office talking to graduating seniors, English majors, who are going off into not extremely luxurious job prospects from graduation with like $100,000 in debt, and feeling complicit in that system was hard, so that really kind of motivated me to say, look, this could happen. If we did this, if we actually created an institution that rid itself of the physical campus and all of the costs attached to the physical campus. And that was also, this was really right around the time, 2011, by this time, right around the time when this was really beginning to enter the national conversation. I mean, I remember the 2012 presidential campaign was the first presidential campaign where tuition and student debt was becoming a talking point for presidential, candidates. And so everyone was, there in 2011 during the campaign being like, what can we do about tuition costs? And I'm like, hey, I've got an idea. People are like, hey, let's do government subsidies and let's like wipe out debt. And I'm like, no, let's not. Maybe instead of enabling the corrupt system that is brought this about, let's change it. Let's just think of a completely new model. So that's in the end one of the main things that pushed me.
Yeah, even going back to 2009 and Occupy Wall Street, and I wrote about this at the time. A lot of the interviews with young people that were pissed off about the Wall Street bailouts was really about this insane debt that they had incurred in
yes.
typical 4-year education. And their reaction was visceral, like, why aren't I getting a bailout? Because I have this insurmountable debt that's going to ruin my life. And I definitely want to get into sort of the economics of the closed system. And you referenced it earlier, with the academic publishing world, publisher perish, and you've talked extensively about this on some podcasts I've listened to, that there is almost a disincentive to be a good teacher.
Yes.
Because all you focus on is this very rarefied. I don't know what it's like in literature. I'm an economist by training, and when I went through a brief period of wanting to be a professor in graduate school, and this rarefied world in the economics world is it's very much a cartel where it's difficult to get published in the right journals. And if you get published in the right journals, it's a very formulaic way of simply manipulating equations that in no way adds to anybody's knowledge. And then nobody reads it. And if you want to read it, you got to spend an insane amount of money to have access to. So it's this closed academic system that is surely fed by all of the money that's thrown at higher education, and not just through tuition inflation.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly the closedness of that system that I was really frustrated with, because it's the problem in my mind. The biggest part of the problem here is I don't have any necessary criticism of the work that scholars are doing. A lot of scholars doing really interesting and really important work, and it's not that the product that is being produced necessarily by the scholarly journals is a bad product. It's the way in which it is closed away. I mean, in this way, the ivory tower thing is real, right? I mean, the general public can't get access. Academic publishing is very, very difficult. I mean, everything, whether it's monographs or whether it's journals, I mean, it is all designed for this, feedback loop of, right, like the scholarly publishing things produce things so that scholarly libraries can buy them. And they know they're only going to sell like 500 copies of a book that they publish, but they're going to charge like $150 for that book, because they know that the big scholarly libraries have the budget to afford it, and they're all going to buy it because they buy everything that press produces automatically, right? And so you've got this system of the small group of people publishing the things with a small group of people buy, and most people can't access any of it. And so therefore it has led to this disregard. And there's not even an attempt or a desire in some sense to engage with the public, to actually engage with what one is tempted to call the real world, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of disconnect, I think, is not healthy for scholarship, and is and it's senseless. Right now, it's senseless. I mean, I can kind of understand how things got there. Back when there had to be resources available for print production and everything, but we don't need that now. There have been all of these.
I thought you were going to say before the invention of the printing press, when everything had to be written out and scribed by scribes.
Well, then it was even harder. It's true,
right?
Right, exactly. The printing press was a good step forward, but the internet has been as big a step forward as the printing press was.
Yeah.
And yet the publishing world has done almost nothing but attempt to inhibit that world and restrict, to try to remake the internet world in the image of the old print world that they had control over, in order to retain financial control over their product. And again, I think that is destructive to education, destructive to just public awareness. These things there should be better ways to share these things. So absolutely.
So this makes you an enemy of sorts, a subversive, undermining this education industrial complex that's sort of feeding off of the cost of $150 textbooks, that kind of thing. And going back to your other point about discovering that there was this huge audience for something that would have been a very rarefied scholarly conversation. It reminds me of someone I talk about a lot. I don't know if you get the reference, but there was this guy at the early days of the internet, John Perry Barlow. He was the lyricist for the Grateful Dead and sort of a technology utopiast, if that's a word. And he talked about something, he uses a phrase that I still cling to in hopes that this is actually what the internet's going to do, the democratization of knowledge.
Yes.
That anybody anywhere had access to the things that used to be closed in an ivory tower. And we could get into all the bad things about the internet, but to me, that's the thing that you seem to be doing.
It is. I mean, that is. Yes. And for me, the very first goal is access. Like that's the that people should have access to the information that's there, and that access should be enabled wherever possible. That doesn't mean, I'm not like I'm not a radicalist who thinks like everything should be free, because the people who do the work need to make money too, right? So I understand that not everything can be made available for free. We don't make everything available for free, but nevertheless, things can be made available for a good deal more affordably than they are, and not with the primary goal of just kind of clutching the to try to protect the rights and everything. So yes, there are lots of ways in which we are hoping to develop a new paradigm. I don't prefer myself to think about myself as a subversive. It's a little bit true, but that's not how I prefer to think of. I think of myself as championing a new paradigm.
Yes. You're a liberator.
Yeah, well, in some ways, yeah. I mean, because if there are better ways that we can do things, if there are ways that we can do things, that we can make things more accessible to people, that we can be more inclusive in the conversation, why shouldn't we do that, right? And that's when it comes to publishing, I think that. When it comes to education, I think that. And those have been many of the things that have really motivated me from the start.
Yeah, and you talk about this a lot, and I'd love for you to get into it, but the irony of the old closed system is that it appears to be destroying the humanities and people's access to the humanities. Talk about that, because you have quite an impressive analysis of it.
Well, so the issue, in my view, what it really comes back to ultimately is financial pressures on higher education. And it has created this really sort of ironic situation because, of course, as the perception, of course, tuition has been at a relatively intolerable level for a while, but it has more and more people have been talking about how intolerable it is, and the pressure has been increasing on universities as more and more people are saying are objecting to student debt and are looking for alternatives or demanding alternatives. And the problem is that universities, they can't offer that. I mean, this is something that I think it's hard for people outside the business of higher education to understand, because they look at the numbers, right? I mean, like they just take like ye old State University, right, with 10,000 students, and they're like, well, they got 10,000 students, each of which student, right, is paying like $20,000 to $30,000. Like I said, they're each paying $25,000, right? And so you're just in your head multiplying 10,000 by 25,000 per year, and you're like, man, these people are just rolling in money, right? There's just piles of money sitting around everywhere in universities. And like there are ways in which that's true. You go walk onto a university campus and you can see it's really expensive. There's a lot of money being spent. There's a lot of resources that are definitely available. People always start talking about Harvard and how rich Harvard is. Harvard is a bad data point in every way. Like, don't talk about Harvard because they have more money than like first world countries. So like that's ridiculous. Like they're a crazy outlier in the world of higher education. But anyway, so you've got so higher education has all this money, but their bills are enormously high. Like the reality is that the majority of higher educational institutions, even though they're bringing in, tens of millions of dollars a year in tuition, are barely breaking even. I mean, they are barely covering their expenses. They cannot afford. There's no way. People say like, you should cut tuition to like a quarter of what it currently is. Man, they cannot, if they had a 5% reduction in tuition, they would be in financial panic. Some of them would go bankrupt. A lot of them are living far closer to the bone than most people would think. Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't economize. It doesn't mean that all of their choices, their financial choices, are wise choices. But they're certainly not bankrolling massive quantities of tuition every year. So as the pressure has grown, the financial pressure has grown from the public against tuition rates. The universities have had two choices. One choice would have been to reduce tuition. They can't do that. That's not an option. So their only other option has been to increase the perceived value of their product, right? Let's try to make people more satisfied with the price, right? By showing them that it's worth it. And so the way that they've done this, and you can see this, go to any university website and you see it right away in all of their programs, is to show you what jobs you qualify for, right? By paying this money to us, you get a return on your investment, or you get an immediate return on your investment by the career doors that are open to you, and the greatly increased earning potential that you get as a consequence. And so, and this is a relatively recent development in higher education, but it's now almost universal. Everybody says, here are the jobs, like with concrete lists. Here are the jobs that you are going to be qualified for if you get this degree or that degree or do this program or that program at our school. And all of these things obviously make it a worthwhile investment, don't you think? So this is where the humanities has really been squeezed into a corner, because the humanities do not come across well on this particular metric. There are very few high-paying jobs out there that, hang out a shingle saying only art history majors need apply. Like there just are very few that fit that category. So it's a real strain to try to justify the humanities in that way. And since the universities have poured all of their efforts, they're thoroughly invested now in this kind of, you qualify for high paying jobs by paying this money for our tuition model, then it's harder and harder for them to justify the humanities. And enrollment in the humanities has been going down and down because this is what all students and all parents are now asking, and they are right to ask it. What are we going to get for all this money? It's a very sensible and important question for them to be asking, and the humanities do not seem to be able to deliver on that because it doesn't qualify you for a job. Now, the thing about the humanities, of course, there's a reason education always used to begin with, like back in the Middle Ages with the 7 liberal arts, right? And you started with the first 3 liberal arts were basically the humanities, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, right? Like everybody started with the foundation of the humanities and then, moved on to whatever kind of professional application they needed. And there's a reason they used to do it that way, because although the humanities do not uniquely qualify you for very many high-paying jobs, the humanities help you to build skills which are essentially important, especially for leadership positions in any job you might have. There is no job that you could possibly have that would not be enriched by being able to write more clearly, communicate more effectively, have greater emotional intelligence. These are things that the humanities train you in really, really well, and always have trained people in really, really well. But that's all being kind of pushed aside, and the humanities are increasing. I mean, you can go through and watch universities, collapsing their humanities programs, cutting whole, humanities departments and things because they're not getting enough enrollment, because it doesn't pay off in that return on investment equation that they have now hardwired into their marketing and even into their educational planning.
Yeah, it's almost as if they become very expensive trade schools where there's an investment, and it's not really education anymore. It's training, and there's nothing wrong with training, but it's a sort of a cost benefit return on investment, and every year as tuition goes up and up and up, it just becomes harder to understand which professions actually pay enough to justify it.
Exactly. No, and that's just it. I mean, most universities, I think, would not enjoy being called very expensive trade schools, but that's how they're marketing themselves. I mean, they themselves have put themselves into that category. All of higher education now is all about proclaiming. I mean, even the accreditors mandate this now. I mean, like, you have to justify, in order to be accredited, you have to justify to your accreditors what career outcomes do your students get. And on the one hand, like, I respect that in the sense of truth in advertising, right? So, like, if you're saying you can get this job, yeah, you should be able to show that it actually does work, right? So for that reason, it's good. But actually to say to, and I've had this conversation with accreditors within the last year, if you want to go to accreditors and say, yeah, we don't do that, actually, because we don't at Signum. We just kind of put not applicable in that part of the accreditation, in our conversation with the accreditors, because we say explicitly, we're not trying to prepare you for a job. We're trying to help you learn. Like, we want to enable education, and you can do lots of things once you're educated, once you do stuff. But we're not trying to say do this in order to get a job. And that is one of the fundamental paradigms, which I think ultimately it has begun already, but I think if it continues, it's going to continue more and more, just to erode the fundamental purpose of education, of intellectually enriching yourself as a person in order to equip you to enter the world and receive whatever additional training or whatever you may need to do, or even training at the same time. As you say, there's nothing wrong with training. Training is really important. But there is, in fact, more to education than mere job training. And that is the thing that increasingly our entire educational system, especially higher education, is beginning to lose sight of.
So as an economist, I think about the radical price inflation in education, and I Googled it beforehand, and I found a credible source that said since 1980, the cost of four-year university has increased by 1,200%. And that's higher than healthcare inflation, which is also insane. It's higher than housing inflation, which is also insane. And it's way above the rate of inflation in that same period. And as an economist, I'm trying to think, okay, what's driving that? And you've touched on one thing that I think is pretty essential. I heard you recently criticize the idea of free college tuition and more recently, President Biden has talked about free community college, which is sort of halfway there, I guess. I don't know, but why are you against that? And do you think that drives the cost of education?
There are a couple of reasons I would be against that. The number one reason I would be against free education is that it's not free. It won't ever be free, right? I mean, someone's paying for it. So the question is, are the students going to be paying for it themselves, or is tax money going to be paying for it? And I have a deep distrust of education paid for by tax money, because that means I don't have enormous confidence in the federal Department of Education to run higher education. To this point, compared to K through 12 education, higher education has been comparatively free of control. There's much less control over higher education than there is just compared to K through 12. There is still a good deal. I mean, the federal DOE still exerts a good deal of pressure on higher education, especially through the accreditation process, because all of the accrediting organizations are themselves overseen by the DOE, and therefore they receive mandates from the DOE, which they then enforce. So there is definitely influence that the federal DOE has. But I just, like, at the end of the day, I fundamentally don't trust politicians and the people appointed by politicians to make the best decisions for education. It does not seem to me a controversial statement to say that that's not the best way to move forward with education. So that's the primary reason why I would not support. I mean, do I think it should be made more available? Yes. But that's why my goal has been, instead of saying, let's try to, develop programs to make it free, I just want to make it affordable. Right. I mean, my vision is for higher education that people can afford to, like, work your way through college, get a job, get a part-time job and pay your tuition as you go and emerge debt free. That's how we do things at Signum. We have our students, leave Signum with, as far as we know, no debt. I mean, I can't absolutely say that no one has taken out a loan I don't know about in order to pay their Signum tuition, but I'd be surprised because it's pretty low. So I'm pretty sure that most of our students emerge without debt, and we are in the middle of developing an undergraduate program which will operate on the same basis.
It's kind of the contradiction of the increased federal involvement and federal funding in education, which starts around 1980. I don't know if they chose that date to produce the number that I said, but there's increased involvement and there's increased subsidization, which makes it more difficult for a lot of students to get into these increasingly expensive universities. It's the irony of subsidies, maybe, that
right. Well,
whatever their intentions were, they're doing the opposite.
Exactly. And that's, of course, what we saw through the whole, in a sense, that's the cause of the student debt program in the first place, right? I mean, it started with a really good idea, a really good subsidy idea, the federal student loan programs, right? Let us put higher education within the reach of everybody. Wow, that sounds like a really great goal. And it was a really great goal, right? So you got the student loan programs so that even the poorest students can have a financial way to get to university. Fantastic. But what happened as a consequence? What happened as a consequence is that now the price ceiling got taken off of higher education, right? Before that, it's true that there were many who couldn't afford to go to university at all, and that's not a good thing, right? But when the universities were selling a product to consumers who had to pay for it themselves, right? Or get their own private loans or whatever, there was a limit to what they could charge, because if they couldn't charge more than the market could bear. But now that there was virtually unlimited, or functionally unlimited student loan money available to anybody for asking, the ceiling was taken off of what they could charge, because now it doesn't matter. right? Whatever we charge, they can afford to pay it, because anyone can afford to pay it, because they can all get these loans. And that's when you see tuition crisis beginning to go up and up and up. Another reason, I think, for the 1980 thing, in the 80s, there was a study done to try to discover what was the primary determining factor that made students choose which college they go to. Colleges which were competing for students wanted to know. So they did this study of what was the number one factor, and the overwhelming, convincing result to on what basis primarily do students choose their college was curb appeal. That was the answer. And so that began an arms race among all of the schools who had the resources. Whoever can have the swankiest campus and the nicest gym and the fanciest sports facilities, because even to students who have no interest in sports, it still says like, wow, I'm going to this really prestigious school. Look at all the stuff, right? And so the cost to schools of their campuses, their investment in their physical plant, went through the roof in the 80s and 90s. And as I said, it's arms race. Like, you could not afford to fall behind. If you were still putting out there the kinds of campuses that students were attending in the 60s, say, you could not compete in today's market. There's no way, right? So you've got to increase. And that's why higher education is in this bind that I was describing before. Now their tuition is unreasonably high, and yet they cannot afford to reduce it even a little bit below the unreasonable level that it's at, because they're barely making ends meet. They're barely able to pay their bills on their tremendously expensive campuses. And that's why my solution, my answer at the beginning back in 2011 when I started up Signum was, hey, you know what? We ditched the campus. Let's just not have a campus. So Signum we have no physical plant of any kind. We're a completely, everybody, all of our staff and our faculty work from home, and all of our classes are online. All of our classes have fully synchronous components. That is students and teachers interacting together in a traditional classroom environment, except online, right? And as a result, our overhead is way less. And it's at the end of the day, from an economic standpoint, it's really not complicated, right? Reduce cost, reduce your overhead, reduce your prices. It's not that hard.
So no curb appeal at all for you guys, right?
No curb appeal at all. That's it.
But
instead, it's tuition appeal. It's like a price tag appeal is basically what we're going for.
It kind of reminds me in reverse, or maybe not in reverse. Before the deregulation of the airline industry, airlines were a quite lavish experience, and you can watch the old movies, and
Yes.
they're drinking champagne, eating caviar. But of course, you and I couldn't have afforded to fly anywhere at any time, so we would take a bus. And with deregulation, there was price competition, and now we all complain that there are no services, but we can also fly wherever we want, whenever we want. So again, it's democratized the ability to travel in a way that I feel like you're democratizing higher education.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I was. My wife and I just watched The Shining for Halloween, and we were reflecting on that in the airplane scene with these huge seats they were sitting in and everything. Yeah, exactly. But no, that's precisely the point. It is. I think that this is a model, and we've been working on building a model for 21st century higher education. I do not think that the online model that we have is just this strange little fringe boutique model. Online education has become, since we started, higher education has become mainstream. But it's still frustrating to me because, of course, it's still being done. The reason it kind of became mainstream for disreputable reasons.
Yeah.
Mainstream higher education did an about face. Like, it was completely anti-online education. I remember that very well from when I started. There was huge suspicion heaped upon anything done online. And then it did an absolute pivot and started embracing it. And now every single major university does online stuff. Even before the pandemic, that was true. But again, it was for disreputable reasons, because they discovered, hey, we can offer the same courses online, but we don't even have to keep paying the faculty, right? We can just get a faculty member to can a course once, and we can keep offering it, and we can keep charging the same amount, right? And some students are paying not only the same amount for their online courses as for their brick and mortar courses at school, but sometimes more. Like, I was talking to these students at this one school, they're like, no, yeah, we have to pay an extra like convenience fee to take an online course. And I'm like, oh
Wow.
man, that is rich.
Yeah.
But anyway, so basically, this was a kind of a desperation move by higher education to bolster their margins, because they were struggling. They were really struggling. People in higher education have not liked to admit that their model was headed towards a financial cliff prior to the pandemic, right? And now everyone in higher education is like trying to pretend the pandemic didn't happen and let's get back to normal, forgetting that normal was not in a good place prior to the pandemic, financially speaking, right? But anyway, it's so the shift that we're looking to do is to say, no, we don't just want to do that. We don't want to just kind of subordinate online education to our model to have it be underpinning the finances of the overpriced original model, but to say, look, this is online education. It's not necessarily for everyone. I don't think brick and mortar schools are ever going to go away. There will always be some. I mean, certainly, like, how's Harvard going to go away? I mean, like, again, they've got more money than God, but there will always be brick and mortar schools. And that's fine. That's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with brick and mortar schools. But I think that online education has really been, it's been a kind of a perverse effect, because the embracing of online education by higher education has made it into a mainstream thing. Now, again, I remember very distinctly in 2011 when I first began Signum talking about online education, and the question always, whether it was in people's mouths or just in their eyes, right, when I would tell them about it, was, is that legit? Is that like a real thing, right? That was everybody's question. Within 3 years of starting that, almost everybody I talked to about it, who asked me what I did, and I was talking about this stuff, had taken an online class somewhere, like had experienced it. But the problem is, they've experienced the kind of subordinated version of it, this kind of automated version of it that's designed to maximize margins.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you, because I think a lot of people, parents going through lockdowns, K through 12, online learning, first of all, it's one size fits all.
Yes.
But the same thing with college, where people are still paying their inflated tuition prices, but they're getting this recording, and that's not real online education. That's a form of torture in my mind. But you guys don't do it that way, right? But you're surely dealing with this new reputational problem of the last year and a half, where online education is a caricature of what you're talking about.
It is. It's true. I mean, for us, in the end, I think the pandemic, the experience that people have had has still been a net gain for us in one sense. And that is, people went from not knowing what online to thinking they knew what online education was, but it wasn't really what we do, right? So I'd be like, oh, so we do online courses, and they're like, oh yes, I've done that before, and I'm like, actually, I bet you haven't, right? Not really, not the way that we do it. And again, there's no like magic, there's no like trade secret about how we do it. It's like really simple. All you have to do is be committed to maximizing contact between teachers and students, and students with each other. Like, that's it. If you're committed to that idea, and that's what which again, sounds simple, but most schools are not, because the whole point of online education in this sort of standard mainstream model to this point has been maximum flexibility. So like, you can do the courses anytime you want, recorded courses, on your own schedule anytime you want. Well, that's the marketing point. But of course, the real point is that the universities can it and they don't have to keep paying faculty for it, right? Whereas again, our approach is we want to maximize the amount of people hours that we're spending doing the education. We want to maximize that content, and that's it. That's the only magical difference between our online education and other online education, is that commitment to maximizing community interactions, teachers and students, advisors and students, students with each other. We want to maximize that online community, and that's what makes our online education special. But yeah, so on the one hand, the pandemic has been really hard for that because now people have had all these negative experiences with people, and I have nothing but sympathy for the teachers, college and K through 12, who were thrust by, I think that administrators in general, school administrators, did a horrible job during the pandemic. They're the ones that I blame for what happened to education during the pandemic, because they did not sufficiently support most administrators' idea of what it meant to support teachers was to give them tech training, right? Like, here's how you use the software. And that is not what teachers needed, right? But like with that tech training, then the administrators expected them to just basically do what you've been doing, except now, online. And that's not how online education works. Like it's not the same kind of conversation. So anyway, you've got to sort of think it through. So a lot of people did have negative experiences with that, but for us so far, the thing that has really counterbalanced that, the idea of doing meaningful, synchronous, meetings, discussions, social interactions online 2 years ago was alien to 90% of folks. The idea that an audio video connection could be used in any way, as a sort of a stand-in for an in-person meeting or an in-person interaction, an in-person conference, something like that, was nobody would have accepted that. If you'd gone 3 years ago and said to any one of the major professional or scholarly conferences or something like that, hey, why don't you do it all over Zoom instead? They would have thought you were completely insane, right? Now, now it's a thing. Everybody understands it. Not everybody loves it, right? But everybody has had some experience enough to know the same kind of experience I had in 2010 when I was experimenting with my podcast. And I went into it dubiously. Honestly, I did not expect. I expected that the kind of synchronous classroom environment that we had established in my first experimental go through, I expected it would do fine in enabling me to transmit stuff, right? I expected that I could I could probably lecture that way, right? But what I was very skeptical about was that the social element would click, would happen, that there would be any classroom chemistry in that class. And I was blown away when I actually experienced it. I was blown away by how that was. Yes, your Zoom call with, your parents and your friends during the pandemic is not the same as being able, to go to lunch with them. But it's also a very great deal better than nothing. It's also, everyone I think has found that these kinds of online interactions have done a better job than they might have expected at enabling them to stay in touch with people, to connect with people in different situations. And so there's some experience of that now. I mean, goodness, even just trying to operate as a distributed organization where everybody was working from home was trying to everyone, it was like you had to reinvent the wheel to do that, because nobody was open to that, very open to that idea either. Again, not that we were unique in that, but it was certainly very far from mainstream 2 years ago. So the fact that everyone is now accustomed to operating in this way, everyone's accustomed to this, it has laid the foundation for many even to overcome the negative experiences they had in an educational environment, and be willing to at least like be imaginatively open to the concept. If this were done well, it actually could work. And so in a lot of ways, it still has really made things a little easier for us.
Yeah, one of the when you dig into the data, looking at the inflated price of school and perhaps the decline in the quality of education, you see that the administrative class is a growing percentage of the budget. So I'm gonna say, if this was a Tolkien metaphor, maybe the education administrators are Sauron or something.
Right. More like Saruman, I think, a mind of metal and wheels. Yeah, but no, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. That has been, and by the way, this is I was talking about how the federal DOE has had a kind of, from not a top-down decree, you shall do this and these shall be your educational standards, but up through the accrediting bodies. That has been, I believe, that the growth of the administrative class is one of the things that we see as a consequence of that. I'm not saying I blame the government, but I kind of blame the government, because what the accreditation standards, again, accreditation standards, which must themselves conform with the standards established by the federal DOE. One of the things that they do is they mandate. It's not about like what happens in the classroom. It's about how you are like watchdogging what happens in the classroom. And so it has been a continual effort as we have interacted with the accreditation process. And Signum is not yet accredited. We are in the accreditation process right now. So I am like right in the midst of all of this stuff. And it is our primary goal is to achieve accreditation, but to maintain our integrity and not to compromise, our mission and our vision and what we're trying to do. And this has been one place where it's challenging, honestly, because there are lots of places where essentially like entire branches of administrators who do nothing but review the work of other administrators are basically required by the standards. And we've had to try to think of sort of creative ways to say, okay, well, no, we're not doing that. Right? We're not doing that. We think we're going to try to meet these standards in other ways. But it is, that. And so there were two things I would say that kind of have led to the growth of the administrative class in my experience. One is, again, it's in order to do all the things that the accreditors say you have to do, it requires a vast team of administrators, not only to report on it, but not only to do it first, but then to report on it afterwards. But then in addition, you have the trend, which has been clear in academia over the last 20 years, the increasing corporatization, not actually corporatization, but the self-conscious modeling of their administrative structure on a kind of pseudo corporate model, right? It's not a real corporate model, right? But it's when provosts and bursars got replaced by vice president of financial development, right? When vice presidents started multiplying at universities around the country, and everybody started structuring their administrations on things that sounded really officially corporate. Again, I think it's I believe that anybody who's actually familiar with corporate structure and the corporate world would find the academic version of, the pseudo-academic, the pseudo-corporate structure within academia a little bit comical in some ways. But nevertheless, it's been that thing, like we're, instead of having a provost, we have a chief academic officer, right? And we had, just like we have our chief financial officer and everything else. And that also has led to the kind of perceived elevation, instead of like your dean being like, so you've got a member of the faculty, right, who becomes dean and stuff and like does a term as dean for a while and then goes back into the faculty and is replaced by somebody else. That's the old model, right, from back in the old days. Now, like, oh man, deaning, like that's a whole profession, right? In fact, there are whole higher education degrees, if you want to get a job as a dean, that you have to get that higher education training to do, and by the way, it's one of the things also that the accreditors apply some pressure for, is like, do you have people who have these degree qualifications in order to be deans, on your.
Yeah, totally. It politicizes the process, because
Yes.
they become politicians in a sense, who are responding to incentives and dealing with them.
Yes.
We're going to run out of time at some point, but I definitely want to talk a little bit about Tolkien. Otherwise, I've done a horrible job talking to you. My gateway is probably very different from yours, but my gateway to Tolkien was Robert Plant and Led Zeppelin. And later Peter Jackson. How did you get into this stuff?
Sure. By the way, I think I won't say Tolkien was my gateway into Led Zeppelin, but I certainly had read Tolkien long before I listened to Zeppelin. But I became a Zeppelin fan in high school when I listened to those songs and realized that Robert Plant was a Tolkien fan, and I'm like, these guys are cool, right? So I've been a Zeppelin fan ever since. But so Tolkien. I mean, I've been reading Tolkien since I was a kid. It was a thing I discovered when I was 8, and that I've really loved. I mean, I think that Tolkien is. Look, The Lord of the Rings is probably the most influential literary work of the 20th century. I mean, it's there's nothing that will make a 20th century specialist in an English department angrier or faster than somebody saying that publicly. And all of the James Joyce scholars out there, scream a scream of rage when you say it. But it's unquestionably true. The Lord of the Rings is the most influential literary work of the 20th century. And there's a reason for that. It has, Tolkien really tapped into something, and we can see it. I mean, you can see it, especially like, look at the trend towards the imaginative and fantastic in films over the last 20, 30 years, right? I remember saying something like 20 years ago, something like, why are the great old traditional myths, like the fall of Troy and and that, like, why aren't there any movies made about those? And I remember people like sort of smiling at me and being like, oh, how quaint an idea that is, right? And now, of course, like all of these things are happening, right? And a lot of this is just, it's part of like the door that Tolkien opened. When Tolkien published The Lord of the Rings, nobody had any idea what to do with it, because everybody knew, in the first half of the 20th century, everybody knew that fantasy literature is only for children, right? I mean, that's just a kid's thing. And here was The Lord of the Rings. There were some adults who still read fantasy books, but they knew they were reading kids' books, right? I mean, you have to have a certain confidence to like read, self-confidence to read kids' books and not be embarrassed about it. But here was The Lord of the Rings, manifestly a book written for grown-ups, like a book unsuitable for young children. Just like it's hard for them to read, right? It's clearly written for adults, and yet unashamedly a fantasy story. And that was a turning point in the modern imagination, which I think has been a really important, and in my opinion, a really wholesome one, actually.
So we have Logan Albright, who is one of the producers here at Free the People, and he's a big fan of your podcast. He has found a Tolkien quote for you that we would love for you to analyze. And by the way, if you didn't know this, we have a libertarian bent here. We don't apologize for that, but Here's what he said. My political opinions lean more and more to anarchy, philosophically understood, meaning the abolition of control, not whiskered men with bombs.
Yes,
What,
that was
what's,
that. That was
what
the.
is
That was
saying?
the.
What do
So
you think about that?
the whiskered men with bombs thing, like that's when you said anarchist in the, I mean, he wrote that letter dates from, it's from one of his letters, which dates from, I think, the 30s. So when in the 1930s you said an anarchist, everybody imagined a guy with a mustache and throwing bombs
Right.
at things. Like that was the classic model, right? And so he said, like, no, I'm not an anarchist in the sense of I want to chuck bombs at things, right? I'm an anarchist in the sense that I think people should be left alone to govern their own affairs. And within the world of the Lord of the Rings, the Shire is pretty much his like anarchical ideal, where there is almost no government of any kind. I mean, he explicitly says they had no government, they have no police. That's not how the Shire works. Like everybody takes care of their own business. If there's like enforcement of rules that has to happen, it happens within families primarily. There is a mayor, right? There is an elected official, but all he does is preside at feasts. Like he doesn't actually have any real authority. And that was very much Tolkien's vision. Now, of course, ironically, the other form of government that he celebrates is hereditary monarchy. So it's like all or nothing in Tolkien's world as far as government is concerned. But there again, he's mostly kind of focused on working out like the mythic ideal, like what does it mean for there to be a good king? Like what does a good king look like? And of course, one of the conclusions, if one were to want to apply his study of kingship in the real world, I think one could certainly not fail to be struck by how little modern political leaders fail to live up to the models that he puts forward for, if you want to wield executive power, this is how it should work. And it's not how it works. One of the things, I think it was actually in that same letter as that quote that you just mentioned, Tolkien says, quoting a Catholic Latin saying, one of the, unfortunately, this was sort of a ritual formula, which totally undermines its actual usefulness. But part of the formula of becoming consecrated as a bishop was the candidate would have to say, noli episcopari, I do not want to be a bishop, right? Like if you sought power, you were disqualified, right? That was part of the ideal. And again, it becomes formalized. And so the person who wants power knows they have to say they don't want power in order to get it. But anyway, he alluded to that in that same letter. And he said, I think for leaders, like for people like in government positions, the primary requirement as of old should be noli episcopari. That is, the only people that you can trust as leaders, as political leaders, are the people who don't want political power, the people who don't want to be in charge. And this is, I often joke about that. This is one thing that I do personally do agree with Tolkien about. I often tell people the one thing I never really support anybody who runs for president, primarily because they obviously want to be president. Like that's, it's the downside, right? If you're investing everything you have in order to try to get elected president, well, that's a pretty big red mark. It would certainly, it would have been a red mark in Tolkien's book. And I personally do kind of agree with him on that.
But if Frodo ran for president, you could trust him with the precious, right?
Well, see, that was exactly like the Tolkien strongly objected to the idea of the Lord of the Rings being a political allegory, right? That is what he was fighting against. You'll often hear people quote that, like how he's like, oh, it's not an allegory, it's not an allegory, because he didn't want people to boil it down to just an allegory, right? However, it is very applicable to the political world. And one of the things that you see is the reason Frodo is the ring bearer is that the Ring of Power is most dangerous against people who have power, people who have abilities. Like if you take somebody who is really smart and really capable and has a strong will and strong charisma, and you put them in a position of power, like that's where things can get really dangerous, right? And so Frodo is the perfect ring bearer because he doesn't want to do it, and because he's not qualified, and because he doesn't have any power of his own. So yeah, you can only entrust the ring if you want to have the ring, even if you want to carry the ring. If you think you can handle it, then that's always in the book a really, really, really bad sign. And so yeah, in a lot of ways, it does. Again, although it was not written in any way as an allegory, it is applicable, as Tolkien said it should be applied. It is certainly applicable, I think, in a lot of ways to the political arena like this. Sometimes some folks have asked me if I've ever thought about running for office, and I always say, well, if I ever ran for office, my platform would be, if you vote for me because if I have elected, I'll take my responsibility seriously, but I really don't want to do this. And I have no interest in this at all. But I don't think I'd be likely to win with that platform.
I don't know. We're getting close where I think someone that is really turned off by power might actually be attractive to people. I always hope that's true, but we'll see. Hey, we've run out of time, but I definitely want you to give folks an idea of where they can find your podcasts and more about the university. And you're working on about 1,000 projects, so
it's true. It's true. Yeah. So my podcast stuff, actually, the easiest place to find everything in one spot is on our YouTube channel. If you go to Signum University, so SIGNUM University, Signum University's YouTube channel, you can find playlists of all of my broadcasts and all the stuff that we do there. For more information on Signum's programs, you can go to signumuniversity.org and find information about our graduate program. We have a professional development program to train people in humanities skills. We have kids programs, extracurricular programs, continuing education. We do a whole bunch of different things, all of it focused on the humanities, specializing in language and literature right now.
Cool. And let's, if you're up for it, let's do an entire show on the political economy of the Shire, because I've never quite thought about it this way, but I'm thinking that maybe Tolkien and Hayek might have met at some point. I don't know.
That would be great. It would be fun. Yeah. Economics is one of the things that, like, of all of his like world building elements, I think Tolkien thought less about economics than he thought about many other things. And yet there are a lot of things that work really interestingly. It would be fun. We should do it.
Cool. Corey, it's been awesome.
Very good. Thank you very much.
That was amazing. Where can I get more content just like that? It's a great question. You're clearly a discerning consumer of the best content. Make sure to like the video, subscribe, and click the bell. And if you're consuming podcasts, go to Apple, Stitcher, anywhere you get them. I'm in. Kibbe on Liberty, honest conversations with interesting people.